There are places in this world that do not shout to be noticed. They do not compete for attention. They do not beg to be photographed or posted. Instead, they wait quietly, patiently, as if they already know that those who are meant to find them will eventually arrive. Kabupaten Tasikmalaya is one of those places. In the heart of West Java, Indonesia, beyond the noise of the cities and the rush of modern life, there exists a land that carries centuries within its soil. A land where mountains remember eruptions, where rivers remember kingdoms, and where culture is not preserved in museums, but still breathes in everyday life. This is not just a region, this is a living story, and once you begin to understand it, you realize something important. Tasikmalaya is not simply a place on a map, it is a journey through time itself. To understand Tasikmalaya, you have to go back before the name even existed. Long before it was called Tasikmalaya in 1913, this land was known as Mount Galunggung, a sacred space deeply rooted in spiritual tradition and local wisdom, a place where the mountain was not just a mountain, but a guardian, a witness, a symbol of power and respect. Then it became the Kingdom of Galunggung, a name that carried authority, structure, and identity. It was followed by Sukakerta, then Sukapura, each name reflecting a transformation, like layers of history slowly building upon one another. Nothing here was ever static, everything evolved, everything changed, and yet something essential always remained: identity. Even when the name Sukapura was replaced in 1913, the spirit of the land did not disappear. Instead, it was reborn in a phrase that still echoes through time: Sukapura Nadaun Nora, a poetic expression that means Sukapura becomes young again, a symbol of renewal, a reminder that even ancient lands can grow again, transform again, and rise again without losing their roots. This is the first truth of Tasikmalaya. It is a place that never truly dies. It only renews itself. Now imagine standing in this land, surrounded by landscapes that seem almost too diverse to belong to one region, because Tasikmalaya is not one kind of beauty, it is many. It is volcanic, it is coastal, it is mountainous, it is warm, it is cool, it is calm, it is powerful, and all of it exists together. One of its most legendary landmarks is Mount Galunggung, a volcano that once erupted with force, reshaping the land and the lives around it. Today it stands quietly, as if reflecting on its own past. Travelers come here not only to see nature, but to feel something deeper, a reminder that destruction and creation are often part of the same story. Nearby, the land softens into something more soothing. Cipanas welcomes visitors with natural hot springs, warm water rising from deep within the earth, offering comfort and healing. People come here tired, stressed, carrying burdens they cannot always explain, and they leave lighter, as if the earth itself has absorbed part of their weight. Then there are waterfalls hidden like secrets in the forest. Known locally as kurug, they fall endlessly through rock and greenery, untouched and pure. Each one feels like a discovery, as if nature is constantly revealing itself only to those willing to search. And when you travel further south, the landscape opens into the coastline. Pantai Cipatujah and Karang Tawulan stretch across the southern edge of Tasikmalaya, where the ocean meets cliffs and open skies. The waves here do not simply crash, they speak, they echo, they remind you that the world is much larger than the boundaries of daily life. In one region, you can stand on volcanic soil, soak in hot springs, stand beneath waterfalls, and watch the ocean, all in the same journey. Tasikmalaya does not offer variety, it offers completeness. But nature is only one part of its identity, because culture here is just as alive as the landscape. Batik in Tasikmalaya is not just fabric, it is expression, it is memory woven into cloth, it is identity made visible. There are three distinctive styles that define its artistic soul. First, the Sukapura motif, strong, earthy, and grounded. Its patterns resemble those found in Madura Batik, with bold lines and natural tones that reflect tradition and strength. Then there is Sawoan. Inspired by fruit patterns, it carries a more organic and flowing identity. Dominated by deep indigo tones, it feels calm yet expressive, like a quiet reflection of nature's abundance. And finally, Tasikmalaya Batik, modern, bold, and vibrant. It breaks expectations with bright colors and confident designs, representing a younger generation that respects tradition but is not afraid to redefine it. Together, these three styles form a visual language, a conversation between past, present, and future. But Tasikmalaya is full of surprises that go beyond what most people expect. Imagine standing on a beach, feeling ocean winds on your skin, and just a short distance away, finding natural hot springs rising from the earth. This is Cipanas in Cipatujah, a rare geological phenomenon where geothermal energy appears near the coastline, only about 2 kilometers from the sea. It creates an experience that feels almost impossible: warm mineral water surrounded by salty ocean air, a place where fire and water seem to exist in quiet harmony. It is not just unusual, it is unforgettable. And then there is architecture that carries memory. Masjid Agung Manonjaya stands as a silent witness to history. Built in 1832 during the era of Sukapura, it is more than a place of worship. It is a monument of endurance. Its structure reflects the architectural wisdom of its time, carrying elegance and strength that has survived generations. Inside its walls, time feels different, slower, heavier, more meaningful. It is not just a building, it is a memory that still stands. Even daily life in Tasikmalaya carries its own uniqueness. In a region spanning 39 districts and over 351 villages, something surprising exists. There are very few active traffic lights. Instead of rigid urban control, traffic flows with human rhythm. People adapt. They communicate through movement, awareness, and understanding. It creates a feeling that is rare in modern regions, a sense of organic order rather than mechanical control. It feels less like a system and more like a living flow. And of course, no journey through Tasikmalaya would be complete without its food. Because here, food is not just nourishment, it is identity on a plate. Nasi tutug onkom, often called nasi to, is one of the most iconic dishes. Warm rice mixed with roasted onkom and seasoned with aromatic kencur. It is simple but deeply flavorful, a dish born from tradition, carrying the essence of everyday life. And then there is kolontong, a traditional snack made from glutinous rice, carefully processed and roasted into a crunchy, sweet, and slightly savory treat. It is not just food, it is craftsmanship. It is patience transformed into taste. Every bite tells a story of tradition passed down through generations. And when you begin to connect all of these elements, something becomes clear. Tasikmalaya is not defined by one thing. It is defined by layers of history that shift names but never lose identity. Layers of nature that combine volcanoes, waterfalls, hot springs, and oceans. Layers of culture expressed through batik, architecture, and daily life. Layers of flavor that preserve memory through taste. This is a region that does not try to impress you quickly. It reveals itself slowly, and the longer you stay, the more you realize something profound. Some places are not meant to be consumed in a moment. They are meant to be understood over time. Tasikmalaya is one of those places. It does not ask for attention, it earns understanding. And once you truly see it, you understand that its beauty is not in how loudly it speaks, but in how deeply it stays with you long after you have left. Because some places are not just visited, they are remembered, and Tasikmalaya is one of them. And if you think that is the end of the story, then you have only seen the surface. Because Tasikmalaya is not a place that ends when the road does. It continues in the details most people walk past without noticing. It lives in the mornings when mist rises slowly over rice fields like a breath the earth never rushes to release. It lives in the sound of farmers stepping through wet soil, not as background noise, but as part of an ancient rhythm that has never stopped playing. This is a land where time does not feel erased by modernity. It feels layered over it. And that is why even today, when you move deeper into the villages, something unusual happens. The world becomes quieter, but not empty. It becomes full in a different way, full of texture, full of presence, full of things that cannot be captured by speed or screens. In Tasikmalaya, life still remembers how to move slowly without losing direction. There is something powerful about that, because in a world that constantly demands urgency, this place quietly refuses to forget stillness. And stillness here is not absence, it is awareness. You can feel it when you walk through traditional markets, where voices rise and fall like waves of human connection. No automation, no distance, just people reading each other in real time, negotiating life face to face. Every transaction is not just exchange, but interaction. A reminder that economy once had a human pulse before it became digital. And then you realize something else. The strength of Tasikmalaya is not only in its landscapes or history, it is in its resilience. This is a region that has survived volcanic destruction, political transformation, cultural shifts, and the pressure of modernization. Yet it never collapsed into forgetting itself. It adapted without erasing its roots. That is not common. Most places lose themselves in change. Tasikmalaya learnt how to carry change without losing identity. Even its people reflect this. There is a quiet pride here, not the kind that needs to be announced, but the kind that shows up in how things are built, how traditions are maintained, and how stories are passed down without needing validation from the outside world. In many ways, Tasikmalaya does not try to be known. It simply continues being itself, and that is why it becomes unforgettable to those who take the time to see it properly. Because once you understand a place like this, you begin to notice something uncomfortable but honest. The world is full of places that are loud but shallow, and also full of places that are quiet but deep. Tasikmalaya belongs to the second kind, but even within its quietness, there are contrasts that feel almost poetic. Modern roads cutting through ancient land, motorbikes passing rice fields that have existed for centuries, schools and mosques standing near natural landscapes that look untouched by time. It is not a separation between old and new, it is coexistence, and somehow it works. Not because it is perfectly organized, but because it is naturally balanced. There is also something deeply symbolic about Mount Galunggung when you return to it with this understanding. It is no longer just a volcano, it becomes a reminder that power does not always announce itself before it changes everything. Sometimes it stays quiet for years, even centuries, before revealing what it is capable of, just like people, just like places, just like history. And when you stand there, looking at the horizon, it becomes clear that Tasikmalaya is not trying to impress the world. It is trying to preserve something the world is slowly forgetting. Continuity, connection, and meaning rooted in place. Even its food culture reflects this philosophy. Nasi tutuk onkom is not just a meal you eat and forget. It is something built from simplicity and repetition. It comes from necessity, from creativity, from people learning how to turn humble ingredients into something comforting and enduring. It represents survival, but also love. The same can be said for kolontong, a snack shaped by patience, made not for instant gratification, but for lasting texture and memory, something that stays with you longer than the moment it is consumed. In Tasikmalaya, even taste has memory, and maybe that is the final lesson this place offers without ever saying it directly, that identity is not built in a single moment. It is built in repetition, in tradition, in remembering what came before while still moving forward. So when people describe Tasikmalaya as just a city of Santri, or just a region in West Java, or just another point on the map, they are only describing the outline, not the depth. Because the truth is, Tasikmalaya is not defined by labels, it is defined by endurance, by how long it has held on to itself while everything around it changed. And if you listen carefully, beyond the wind, beyond the markets, beyond the waves of Cipatujah, beyond the silence of its mountains, you begin to understand something simple but powerful. Some places are not built to be conquered, they are built to be understood. And Tasikmalaya does not reveal itself all at once, it reveals itself for a lifetime. And even after all of that, there is still something deeper waiting beneath the surface. Because Tasikmalaya is not just a story of land, culture, or history, it is also a story of people who never stopped shaping it, even when the world changed faster than they did. In the villages spread across its 39 districts, life continues with a kind of quiet determination that rarely makes headlines but defines everything in reality. Farmers still rise before the sun, not because tradition tells them to, but because the land still demands patience. Fishermen along the southern coast still read the ocean the way their ancestors did, not with instruments first, but with instinct passed down through generations. This is knowledge that was never written in textbooks. It was lived, and that is why it survives. There is something powerful about a society where wisdom is not separated from daily life, where children grow up not just hearing stories, but watching them happen, where identity is not a concept, but a routine. And in Tasikmalaya, that routine is still alive. But what makes it even more extraordinary is how it exists alongside change. You can see modern education systems growing in the same space as ancient traditions. You can see young people holding smartphones while still participating in cultural rituals that have existed for centuries. It is not a clash. It is not a conflict. It is a conversation between generations happening in real time. And somehow, both voices are still being heard. This balance is fragile in many parts of the world, but here it has not broken, yet. Because places like Tasikmalaya are constantly negotiating between preservation and progress, between remembering and adapting, between holding on and letting go just enough to survive. And that negotiation is visible everywhere, in architecture that blends old stone foundations with newer structures, in mosques that stand unchanged while the neighborhoods around them evolve, in roads that cut through landscapes that once belonged only to nature. Even the rhythm of life itself reflects this tension, slow in one moment, fast in another, traditional in one corner, modern in the next, still grounded, yet always moving. And perhaps that is what makes Tasikmalaya so human, because it is not perfect, it is alive, and living things are never static. They grow, they struggle, they adapt, they remember. There is also a quiet emotional truth here that cannot be ignored. Tasikmalaya does not only carry beauty, it carries effort. Every rice field carved into the hillsides represents labour across generations. Every cultural motif in Batik represents hours of repetition, correction, patience and pride. Every dish served on a simple plate carries the weight of survival turned into tradition. Nothing here is accidental. Everything here is earned. Even the landscape itself feels like it has been negotiated with time. The mountains did not simply appear as scenery, they shaped livelihoods. The rivers did not just flow, They carved boundaries of settlement and connection. The coastline did not just exist, it defined trade, survival, and interaction with the wider world. This is why Tasikmalaya feels different when you truly pay attention. It is not because it is louder than other places, it is because it is honest. And honesty in geography is rare. When you reach the southern edge again, standing where land meets ocean, there is a moment where everything seems to align. The wind carries salt and memory. The waves repeat patterns that have existed long before human language described them. The horizon stretches without asking for interpretation. And in that moment, you realize something quietly profound. This place does not need to prove itself. It has already endured enough to be undeniable. Even Mount Galunggung, when seen in silence, feels like a reminder that greatness is not always about constant expression. Sometimes it is about restraint, about waiting, about holding power without needing to show it every day. That same principle lives in the people here. Strength without performance, identity without exaggeration, culture without advertisement. And perhaps that is why Tasikmalaya rarely appears at the center of global conversations, yet remains deeply rooted in its own world. It does not chase visibility, it maintains continuity. And continuity is more powerful than attention, because attention fades, but continuity builds civilizations. When you look at the Batik again, at Sukapura, Sawawan, and Tasikan motifs, you begin to see them not just as art, but as a timeline, a visual representation of how a community understands itself across generations. Earth tones of tradition, indigo depth of reflection, bright modern colors of transformation. 3 identities, 1 heritage. And that is the essence of Tasikmalaya itself. Not one thing, not one moment, but a long unfolding of identity that refuses to be simplified. Even its food, again, returns to this idea. Nasi tutug onkom is not just flavor, it is repetition made meaningful. Kolontong is not just a snack, it is patience made edible. These are not products of convenience, they are products of memory. And memory is the strongest form of culture, because once something is remembered collectively, it stops belonging to individuals. It becomes shared existence. So when you hear people speak about Tasikmalaya as a quiet region, understand that quiet does not mean empty. It means full of things that do not need noise to survive. And in a world that is constantly increasing its volume, that kind of place becomes even more important, because it reminds us of something we often forget, that not everything valuable is loud, not everything powerful is visible, and not everything meaningful needs to announce itself. Some things simply continue existing, and that alone is enough. Tasikmalaya continues, and in doing so, it tells a story far larger than geography. It tells a story about endurance, about identity, about a place that chose not to disappear into time, but to walk alongside it. And still, even after tracing its history, its landscapes, its culture, its food, and its people, there is one final layer of Tasikmalaya that cannot be fully mapped. Because some parts of a place are not physical at all, they are emotional. They live in the way it makes you feel when you leave. There is a strange phenomenon that happens with Tasikmalaya. You do not simply remember it like a destination you visited. You carry it like a mood that returns unexpectedly, in quiet moments, in unfamiliar cities, in the middle of ordinary days that suddenly feel a little less grounded than before. It does not leave you when you leave it. It follows you. Not in a loud way, not in a dramatic way, but in fragments, a memory of mountain air, a recollection of warm earth after rain, the taste of something simple that somehow felt complete, the image of green fields stretching without hurry, the sound of waves that did not ask anything from you except attention. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to compare every fast place to this slower one, every crowded space to this quieter one, every loud city to this grounded region that never tried to compete. That is when you understand the deeper truth. Tasikmalaya was never trying to impress you. It was trying to recalibrate you, to remind you that speed is not the only form of progress, that silence is not absence, that tradition is not stagnation, and that identity is not something you constantly reinvent, but something you continuously return to. In that sense, Tasikmalaya is not just geography, it is a perspective, a way of seeing the world where history is not behind you, but beneath you, supporting everything you stand on, even when you forget it is there. And perhaps that is why its transformation story matters so much. From Kabuyutan Galunggung to Kingdom, from Sukhakerta to Sukapura, and finally to Tasikmalaya. These are not just name changes, they are evidence that identity can evolve without breaking, that continuity does not require stillness, it requires memory. And memory in this land is not fragile, it is structural. You can see it in the architecture that still stands despite centuries passing. You can see it in rituals that survive modernization. You can see it in language, in batik, in food, in daily habits that continue even when everything else changes. And yet, Tasikmalaya is not frozen in time. That is the most important misunderstanding to avoid. It is not a museum. It is a living system, a place where students study in modern classrooms during the day and return to homes where tradition still shapes values at night, where technology exists but does not erase connection, where roads are built but mountains are not forgotten, where progress is welcomed but identity is not negotiated away. This balance is rare and fragile, but still present. And that presence is what makes Tasikmalaya feel different from places that have fully surrendered to uniformity. Because here, variety is not something curated for tourism, it is natural. Volcano and ocean, hot spring and waterfall, village and town, old and new, silence and movement, all existing within the same boundary without needing to resolve into one single identity. And maybe that is the final lesson this place offers without ever stating it directly. That unity does not require sameness, it requires coexistence. When you stand again at the edge of Cipatujah, where hot springs rise only kilometers from the sea, that lesson becomes almost physical. Two opposites sharing the same land without conflict. Heat and salt air, earth energy and ocean wind, stillness and motion. And instead of contradiction, there is harmony. Not perfect harmony, but real harmony. The kind that exists in lived environments, not idealized ones. Then you think again about Masjid Agung Manonjaya, standing since 1832, not because it avoided change, but because it survived it. It adapted to time without losing its core purpose, a structure that carries both faith and memory in the same breath. And that is what Tasikmalaya ultimately becomes when you step back far enough to see it fully. Not just a region, not just a culture, not just a landscape, but a long continuity of adaptation without disappearance. A place that has learned how to remain itself while everything around it moves. And in a world where change often means replacement, that is a quiet kind of resistance, a quiet kind of strength, the kind that does not need recognition to exist, because it is already complete within itself. And so when the story finally settles, when the noise fades, when the details stop stacking and begin to blend, what remains is not information, it is impression. Tasikmalaya is not something you finish learning, it is something you continue understanding long after you think you are done. And that is why it stays, not as a memory, but as meaning. And even then, there is still one more truth waiting at the edge of everything we have said, because Tasikmalaya is not only remembered in landscapes, history, or culture, it is remembered in transformation. The kind of transformation that does not announce itself with sudden change, but arrives slowly, almost invisibly, like water reshaping stone over time. You see it in the younger generation, in how they move between two worlds without fully abandoning either one. They speak the language of modern life, digital life, global life, but they still inherit stories that were never written down, stories told in kitchens, in fields, in mosques, in long evenings where time does not feel measured by hours, but by presence. They are not replacing the past, they are carrying it forward in a different form. And that is not simple. It requires balance that many places struggle to maintain, because when modernity enters too quickly, memory can break. But in Tasikmalaya, memory bends instead of breaking. It adapts, it finds new shapes, it continues existing inside new expressions. You can see it in how traditional Batik is now studied alongside design innovation, how old motifs are not abandoned but reinterpreted, how culture is not locked away but reintroduced in ways that speak to a new generation without losing its origin. Sukapura becomes modern interpretation, Sawawan becomes artistic identity, Tasikan becomes creative evolution, but none of them disappear. They overlap, they coexist, they continue the same conversation in different tones. And that is something rare, because most places either preserve the past like a museum artifact or erase it in pursuit of the future. Tasikmalaya does neither. It negotiates, and negotiation is one of the most difficult forms of survival. Even its landscapes seem to understand this balance instinctively. Mount Galunggung does not compete with the ocean. The ocean does not erase the mountain. The hot springs do not cancel the coastline. The waterfalls do not interrupt the rice fields. Everything exists within proximity, not opposition. It is not separation, it is layering. And layering is how depth is created. This is why the experience of moving through Tasikmalaya feels less like travel and more like unfolding. Each kilometre reveals a different version of the same identity. Each turn of the road adds another dimension. Each village feels like a different sentence in the same long story. And by the time you think you have understood it, you realize you have only encountered one layer of it. That realization changes something in you, because it forces you to accept that understanding a place is not about finishing it. It is about returning to it mentally, emotionally, repeatedly. Tasikmalaya becomes less of a destination and more of a reference point, a reminder of what continuity looks like in real life, not in theory, not in history books, but in everyday existence. And even its so-called simplicity is misleading, because simplicity here is not absence of complexity, it is the refinement of it. A bowl of nasi tutuk ongkom looks simple, but it carries agriculture, tradition, adaptation, flavor memory, and survival strategy in a single plate. Kolontong looks like a humble snack, but it is technique, patience, and cultural transmission compressed into something you can hold in your hand. Nothing is actually simple. It is just made to feel natural, and that is a different kind of mastery. As you move once more through the imagined streets, past markets, past fields, past coastlines, you begin to understand that Tasikmalaya does not exist as one narrative. It exists as many simultaneous narratives happening at once. History happening beside modern life, tradition happening beside innovation, stillness happening beside movement, and none of them cancel each other out. They reinforce each other. That is why it never feels fragmented. It feels complete. And completeness is rare in a world that constantly separates things into categories that were never meant to be separated. In the end, Tasikmalaya is not asking to be admired. It is asking to be noticed properly, not quickly, not superficially, but fully. And even that request is not loud. It is quiet, almost invisible, like everything else that defines it. And perhaps that is why its impression lasts longer than expected, because it does not overwhelm the senses, it settles into them. It becomes part of how you interpret other places afterward. A quiet benchmark, a reference for depth, a reminder that identity can be stable without being static and changing without being lost. So when the story finally reaches its silence, it does not feel like an ending. It feels like a continuation somewhere else. Because Tasikmalaya does not end when you stop describing it. It continues when you start remembering it differently. And in that way, it is no longer just a place in West Java. It becomes something larger, a way of understanding that some of the most important things in life are not meant to be consumed quickly. They're meant to be lived with, slowly, repeatedly, and with attention that never fully runs out. And if there is still more to say, then it is only because Tasikmalaya itself refuses to be reduced into a final sentence. Because some places are not designed to be concluded, they are designed to keep unfolding in the mind of anyone who has truly encountered them. And now we arrive at something even more subtle, the idea of belonging. Tasikmalaya is not only a place you observe, it is a place that quietly tests how deeply you are willing to belong to understanding something beyond surface level. It does not ask you to stay physically, it asks you to stay mentally present long after you have left. That is why its memory behaves differently. It does not fade in a straight line, it returns in fragments. A smell of earth after rain that suddenly feels familiar. A pattern in fabric that reminds you of something you cannot fully name. The sound of wind through trees that briefly feels like a voice you once heard in a different place. A taste that feels like history without needing explanation. And slowly, without permission, Tasikmalaya becomes part of your internal reference system, a quiet comparison point for how you see other places. Not because it is superior, but because it is coherent in a way that feels rare. It holds itself together across contradictions, and coherence in a world of fragmentation feels almost like a form of comfort. You begin to understand that what makes Tasikmalaya powerful is not one defining feature, not one landmark, not one cultural identity, not one natural wonder, but the way all of them refuse to separate from each other. Everything here is interconnected. Mountains are not separate from villages. Villages are not separate from traditions. Traditions are not separate from food. Food is not separate from memory. Memory is not separate from identity. Everything loops back into everything else. And that looping structure is what creates depth. Even its transformation over time reflects this logic. The shift from Kabuyutan Galunggung to kingdom, from Sukakerta to Sukapura, from Sukapura to Tasikmalaya, is not a break in history. It is a continuous redefinition of the same core identity. Like a river changing its path, but never changing its essence. That is why history here does not feel like something behind you. It feels like something underneath everything you are currently standing on, supporting it, shaping it, holding it together. And when you begin to think in that way, Tasikmalaya stops being a location. It becomes a structure of meaning, a reminder that identity does not need to be fixed to be real. It only needs to remain connected to itself through time. Even the most modern parts of Tasikmalaya do not escape this pattern. New roads, new schools, new technologies, new lifestyles. All of them exist, but none of them fully overwrite what came before. They are added layers, not replacements. And that is a critical distinction, because replacement erases, but layering preserves. And preservation through layering is what gives Tasikmalaya its unusual depth. It does not freeze time, it accumulates it. That accumulation is visible everywhere once you learn how to see it. In architecture that blends eras, in cultural practices that evolve without disappearing, in daily routines that still carry echoes of older systems of life. Even silence here feels layered, not empty, but full of things that do not need to be spoken to exist. And perhaps that is the final paradox. Tasikmalaya feels quiet, but it is never simple. It feels traditional, but it is never static. It feels local, but it is never isolated. It feels familiar, but it is never fully known. And that combination is what makes it difficult to define, but easy to remember. Because definition is about limitation, but memory is about expansion. So when people try to summarize Tasikmalaya in a single phrase, they are not failing because they lack information. They are failing because the place itself refuses compression. It expands beyond summary, beyond category, beyond expectation. And so the only way to truly approach it is not to define it, but to stay with it mentally long enough for it to reveal its patterns. Slowly, repeatedly, patiently, like the land itself teaches. And when you do that, something subtle happens. You stop seeing it as a region in West Java and start seeing it as a way of understanding how places can hold identity without losing change, how culture can evolve without erasing itself, how history can continue without becoming a burden, and how simplicity can still contain depth that is almost infinite when observed carefully. At that point, Tasikmalaya is no longer just something you describe, it becomes something you think with, a quiet companion in how you interpret the world. And that is why it does not end here, because places like this are not finished when their facts are told. They are finished only when people stop noticing what those facts actually mean. And Tasikmalaya, in all its layers, never really allows that to happen. And even now, as the story stretches further, there is a strange realization that begins to form. Tasikmalaya is not just remembered because of what it is remembered because of how it makes the idea of place feel different afterward. It changes the scale of attention. After encountering it, you start noticing smaller details in other places too. The way a river bends behind a village, the way old architecture survives beside new construction, the way food carries memory without needing explanation, the way people move between tradition and modern life without announcing the transition. It sharpens perception almost quietly, and that is not something every place can do, because most places are experienced and then filed away. Tasikmalaya lingers in a different way. It does not stay as a single memory. It reorganizes how memory itself works. It teaches your attention to slow down without forcing it. It teaches your interpretation to widen without overwhelming it. And most importantly, it teaches that depth is not rare because it is hidden. It is rare because it requires time. In Tasikmalaya, time is not something that pushes everything forward at the same speed. It moves unevenly, depending on where you are and what you are observing. In the highlands, time feels stretched. In the villages, it feels cyclical. In the coastal areas, it feels rhythmic. In cultural spaces, it feels layered. So instead of one uniform experience of time, you get multiple versions of it existing side by side. And that is disorienting in the most meaningful way, because it breaks the assumption that time must feel the same everywhere. It does not. And once that assumption breaks, many other assumptions begin to loosen as well. That is when Tasikmalaya stops being just geography and becomes something closer to understanding. You begin to see why its identity never fully simplifies into a single narrative, because it is not built on uniformity, it is built on coexistence. Even contradictions are not treated as problems here. They are treated as normal conditions of life. Hot springs near the sea, mountains near settlements, tradition beside innovation, silence beside movement, old kingdoms behind modern districts, sacred spaces beside everyday markets. Instead of resolving these into one direction, Tasikmalaya allows them to remain as they are. And that tolerance for complexity is part of its character. It does not force harmony, it allows it to emerge. That is a very different kind of strength, and it is the kind that is often invisible at first glance. Even its historical transformations reflect this patience. From Kabuyutan Galunggung to Sukapura, from Sukapura to Tasikmalaya, there is no clean rupture, no dramatic erasure, just gradual transition, where each era leaves something behind that the next era does not fully remove. So the past is never gone, it is just reconfigured. And that is why walking through this region, even in imagination, feels like moving through overlapping timelines rather than a single present moment. You are always standing in more than one time at once, and that is a rare experience in the way humans usually understand places, because most environments ask you to be in the present. Tasikmalaya quietly asks you to be aware of the present, the past, and continuity all at once. That is why even simple things feel heavier here. A traditional dish is not just food, it is continuity. A batik pattern is not just design, it is encoded memory. A mosque is not just architecture, it is a timeline made visible. A coastline is not just scenery, it is a boundary of centuries of interaction. Everything carries more than itself, and that more is what gives the place its emotional weight, not intensity, depth. And depth is harder to explain because it does not rely on dramatic moments, it relies on accumulation, slow accumulation of meaning over time. That is why Tasikmalaya does not overwhelm you. It settles into you, like something that was always meant to be noticed, but only reveals itself when you stop rushing past it. And when you finally accept that, something changes in how you understand not just this region, but all regions. You stop asking what a place is, and start asking what a place contains, because containment is more accurate than definition. Tasikmalaya contains history, culture, nature, adaptation, memory, and identity all at once without separating them into categories that cancel each other out.
And that is its quiet achievement. Not dominance, not fame, not spectacle, but continuity of complexity. And even as this long reflection continues, there is no point where it feels complete, because completeness would suggest closure, and Tasikmalaya does not operate in closure. It operates in continuation. So even here, at what feels like the edge of explanation, the only honest ending is not an ending at all. It is a recognition that some places are not meant to be fully captured. They are meant to be continually re-understood. And Tasikmalaya will always remain one of them. And still, even after all these layers of meaning, there is one final truth that quietly sits beneath everything else.
Tasikmalaya is ultimately not just a place you describe, it is a place you learn to read. Like a language that never fully translates into a single meaning, but instead reveals itself differently depending on who is paying attention. If you look at it through history, it becomes a timeline of transformation. If you look at it through culture, it becomes a living archive of identity. If you look at it through nature, it becomes a layered ecosystem of contrasts. And if you look at it through people, it becomes a story of continuity carried forward without interruption. But if you step back far enough, something even more subtle appears. All of those perspectives are happening at the same time, not separately, not in sequence, simultaneously. And that simultaneity is what makes it difficult to ever fully finish understanding it. Because understanding usually depends on simplifying something into a single frame. Tasikmalaya resists that instinct. It expands beyond it. Even its quietness becomes part of that expansion. Because here, silence is not empty space between events. It is part of how events are processed. It is how life absorbs itself. It is how change becomes digestible instead of overwhelming. That is why nothing here feels rushed, even when change is clearly happening. There is a natural pacing to existence in this region that does not depend on external expectations. And in a world that increasingly measures progress by acceleration, that kind of pacing feels almost unfamiliar, but also grounding. And grounding is not something that is often recognized until it is missing elsewhere. That is why people do not always realize what they are experiencing when they encounter places like Tasikmalaya. They often describe it in fragments: beautiful scenery, rich culture, peaceful atmosphere. But what they are actually sensing is something deeper than any single one of those descriptions. They are sensing coherence, a rare alignment between land, history, and human life that has not been fractured into unrelated parts. Even the simplest details contribute to this sense of coherence. A rice field is not just agriculture, it is continuity of survival. A market is not just commerce, it is continuity of interaction. A road is not just infrastructure, it is continuity of connection. A tradition is not just ritual, it is continuity of identity. Everything is part of something larger without needing to announce that it is. And that is why Tasikmalaya does not feel like a collection of attractions. It feels like a system of meaning, a system that has been built slowly, adjusted gradually, and preserved through repetition rather than disruption. That is also why its transformation over centuries does not feel like replacement. It feels like evolution. Not the kind that abandons what came before, but the kind that carries it forward in new forms. And in that sense, Tasikmalaya becomes less about what has changed and more about what has remained intact through change. That continuity is the invisible structure beneath everything else. It is what allows mountains, oceans, villages, traditions, and modern life to exist side by side without collapsing into contradiction. And when you finally begin to see that structure, even faintly, something shifts in how you understand the idea of place itself. A place is no longer just land with boundaries. It becomes a relationship between time, memory, and presence. And Tasikmalaya is one of the clearest expressions of that relationship. Not because it tries to be, but because it simply continues being what it is across time without losing its internal connection.
That is why even this long reflection cannot turn it into something fully contained, because containment would require reducing it, and reduction would erase what makes it meaningful in the first place. So instead of ending with a conclusion, what remains is something closer to awareness, that Tasikmalaya is not a story that finishes when it is told. It is a story that continues whenever it is remembered. And in that sense, it is always still unfolding, not in geography, but in understanding. And understanding, once it begins, never really stops.